Hello, Sermon Brainwave listeners and viewers. This is Matt Skinner, inviting you to join Karoline, me, and Sermon Brainwave alum Joy J. Moore at Ghost Ranch on August 11th through 15th, 2025. This 4-night preacher's retreat includes presentations and workshops, worship, and lectionary-based study, all designed to enhance your gifts as a biblical preacher. Take in the awe-inspiring landscape of the high desert near Santa Fe, New Mexico. Visit the Working Preacher homepage and click on the link under Preacher's Retreat for details. Sign up today.
Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Rolf Jacobson.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Matt Skinner.
And this is the podcast for March 16th, 2025. First reading is Genesis 15, 1 through 12, and 17 through 18. Psalm 27, Philippians 3, 17 through 4, 1, and the gospel reading is Luke 13, 31 through 35.
So second Sunday of Lent, we've come off of the temptation according to Luke, which is always the first Sunday in Lent, and now move into this apparent warning from the Pharisees for Jesus with regard to Herod and what awaits Jesus in Jerusalem. So it's an interesting way to think about, in the context of Lent, Jesus going to Jerusalem, what you hear are these warnings or the realities of what Jesus is going to face in Jerusalem. And then particularly around the foretelling or Jesus' own recognition that this is where prophets die. And so I think what it does is offer preachers a way to cast what is awaiting in Jerusalem, and maybe in a little bit different light. What does it mean to, as Rolf loves, journey to Jerusalem, journey through Lent? But what does it mean to have this kind of warning and this kind of reality that frames that travel to Jerusalem or our own Lenten process, right? To go to the cross. So that's one thing that I was thinking about this year.
Yeah, it also helps set the context for what Jerusalem means in Luke and in Acts, the way he talks about it here, the lament about the city.
Yeah, and what does it mean, Matt?
Jerusalem is more than the sum total of the people who live there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Richard Swanton does a really good job talking about how it looms and how as well there's a sense of the collapsing of time here, that in the story time, Jesus expects Jerusalem to be a place of violence against him. In the time in which Luke was written, after the year 70, there's also a kind of pathos or a kind of lament about the eventual destruction of the city. Now, the question is, does Luke understand the fall of the city to be some kind of consequence or payback for the rejection of the Messiah? That's a bigger question that you probably don't want to dig into in this particular sermon, but it does kind of reflect as well the idea of God as the Lord of history, that Jesus seems to see Herod's threat here as totally without teeth, without danger, right? He's telling him, I'm going to keep doing my work. It's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. In other words, his destiny, so to speak, is to go to Jerusalem and to encounter resistance there. In Luke 19, he'll talk about Jerusalem failing to recognize the time of its visitation. Mm-hmm. That's part of it. There's a way in which when he's in Jerusalem, when we get to the Passion narrative, it will look like the people of Jerusalem, halaos in Greek, are the ones who actually demand and actualize his death, which is kind of a literary trick and maybe a bit of a theological trick, moving the attention off of Pilate and onto them. So it symbolizes this sense of rejection from his own people. And by own people, I don't mean all Jews, but this kind of idea of Jerusalem centrality and the temple centrality, and the idea of Jerusalem as a kind of bulwark against the dangers and the chaos of the world, presumably.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the way that Jerusalem becomes a character, right, in the story. It's not just a setting or a location, but what does it represent? And And also Jesus' knowledge of that. I mean, also the phrase of, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, sort of foreshadowing his entrance right into Jerusalem. And so you also get this really kind of poignant sense of Jesus' own destiny and Jesus' own obedience here that I think could be another homiletical, not to like over psychologize Jesus or look into the mind of Jesus, but what does it mean that he is the one who comes in the name of the Lord? What does it mean that he is this prophet of God, and the full awareness really of what that's going to require of him and what that means for him? It could also be another sort of, I think, homiletical direction one could take.
Yeah, there's going to be a spirituality about his death as well when it comes time for the passion narrative, that it's not, let me back up. Luke does not see the story as simply one of political intrigue or one of political powers figuring out how to have their way with Jesus. Back to the story of the testing in the wilderness where the devil departed until an opportune time. That time's going to be at the arrest. And so there's a kind of diminishing of the threat of Herod Antipas here. You know, Jesus is like, I'm really not afraid of this guy. He's really not the threat. The threat is Jerusalem. And again, that's not the sum of the population there. It's a bigger kind of spiritual problem that he comes to confront, to name, and then to suffer under.
I think the other piece that I would bring in, depending on which direction you would go, is also the sort of sense of, I guess I would say again, poignancy of the way, and we have this lovely image of how Jesus desires to, like a hen gathering her brood under her wings, you know, bringing his people or bringing his followers into that protection of an empire, from an empire that is out, whether it's, you know, the time of Jesus or after 70, of an empire that's out to get them. And Jesus is offering this protection, this loving relationship, this loving God, and yet people are resistant to it or unwilling. And why? Why is it that they are? Why is it that they do reject the prophet? Why is it that they do? Why are they rejecting that protection and that love and that relationship? And so that's, I think that's another worthy homiletical Lenten theme too, is how much of Jesus' obedience are we willing to accept? Are we willing to recognize? How do we reflect on that during Lent?
What do you mean by how much of his sacrifice we're willing to recognize?
I think what I mean by that is how much do we see, you know, what obedience to God means, and where is it that we resist what Jesus is offering, and why do we, you know, what is it about the human condition that looks at Jesus' obedience, looks at Jesus' sacrifice, if you want to use that term, and says, no, I'd rather choose another way. And so that's another contrast too, right? Of the reality of Jerusalem as a character, and then the reality of this image or metaphor of a hen caring for her brood. I think there's really something striking in that.
Yeah, that the human condition really wants, like, the glory, the strong man.
Yeah.
Doesn't want crucified Messiah, a suffering God.
I think we already get a glimpse of that here, potentially. Even, you know, we still have 4 weeks to go, but 4 or 5 weeks, something like that.
We also have that Jesus is very anti-canine here, very anti-fox, pro-hen.
The anti-fox.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a defensive chicken? They're pretty ferocious. I find them scary.
Seen an aggressive, especially rooster.
Yeah.
They're very...
I wouldn't be messing with any poultry.
Exactly. I mean, my point is there is a sense of loving protection here and intimacy. There's also a sense of the ferocity of his desire to protect them.
As a mother,
we'll have some interesting images. We've got this coming up. We've got the gardener who fertilizes and nourishes a tree. Next week, we're going to have the prodigal son and the father who lavishes belonging and gifts upon him. Then we're going to have Mary's house in John, chapter 12, where you have a sense of care and belonging. So there's this interesting, I'm not sure this is intentional, but I see at least in the gospel texts this in the following 3 weeks.
Yeah.
A sense of not an abstract Jesus at all, or not abstract care, but real kind of hands-on, so to speak, tactile, concrete ways of expressing and receiving care and affection.
Yeah.
I do want to make a comment also about the line, "It is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem," and just explore what Jesus could have meant by that, because within the Old Testament story, that's obviously not true. That especially at like the end of Jeremiah 26, it talks about how there was another prophet at the same time as Jeremiah prophesying against Jerusalem, against the king, who then tried to escape to Egypt and is killed outside of Jerusalem. And you get obviously the stories in the northern kingdom of the Old Testament where prophets are killed outside Jerusalem. Seems to me that what that really means is the outside Jerusalem is not geographical but political. Jerusalem here is the king or those in power. That within the biblical story, it's not, Jesus isn't making the case that, it's just a political place, or as Matt was saying, the sum of the people, but rather what does Jerusalem represent? And that it represents, well, that's the question, I guess, and what does it represent? But one thing it represents to me is it represents the human dimension of the people that not only doesn't want a God who suffers for them, but is willing to put to death anybody who challenges the notions of power and prestige and political might that Jerusalem and the king represent.
Yeah.
I don't know if that captures enough of it.
Yeah, that's helpful.
It's really important for this author that Jerusalem somehow be held responsible, because then in the first 4 chapters of Acts, you're going to have a lot of preaching in Jerusalem that's going to talk about the need for repentance. In other words, Jerusalem's going to be offered and be called to repentance. And when Peter's preaching to all these folks in the temple in the early chapters of Acts, it's ridiculous to think that these are all the same people that somehow called for Jesus' death previously, right? But there is this sense of collective responsibility so that there might be a collective restoration or a collective repentance that also takes place. And obviously, we have to handle that with care so we don't turn it into some kind of a Jesus rejecting Judaism message, but it's an interesting way to talk about corporate responsibility and the corporate blessings that flow out of what happens with Jesus. There we go.
What's Genesis doing here?
It's just doing its thing. What?
Genesis doing its thing.
You're like, who invited Genesis to the party? I'm like, that's all right. Genesis is at the party.
Well, whatever Genesis is doing here, what this story is doing is pledging God's willingness to die for the people. This is one of the covenant initiation stories in the story of Abram and Sarai. But it's really the most powerful one, because God here goes through the ritual of cutting a covenant. So our language of cutting a deal or cutting a covenant comes from this ritual. And the ritual is so that, and you get this, our full understanding of the meaning comes from this story, but then some context that's again from the book of Jeremiah, but so that the animals are cut in half. So the heifer is cut in half, the goat's cut in half, the ram's cut in half, and then the turtle dove and the pigeon are both killed. And then the one making the covenant walks down the center between the animals that have been cut in half and says, I pledge myself to the covenant. And the idea is, and it's not laid out here in Genesis, if I don't keep the covenant, let happen to me let be done to me what has already happened to these animals. That is, that let me be cut in half. And the one going down the middle is not Abram, but God. So I think it goes really well with Jesus' intent to go to Jerusalem, because God is saying, if I can't keep this covenant, let me be put to death. And in the end, that's what happens to Jesus, that God is willing to keep God is so intent on keeping the covenant that God is willing to be put to death. And finally, the only way to keep the covenant with faithless human beings is for God to be willing to be put to death to keep the covenant.
See, so wasn't that a great question? What is Genesis doing here? Yeah,
Like
I
Dave.
thought so too.
No, I appreciated the question.
That's a great question and a great answer. You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, all the theological heft that you pull out of there is great. As you think about preaching this, it's also interesting how this is part of this ongoing relationship between God and Abram, which is still very young. And, as we read through Genesis, it's still not exactly clear who this God is or what this God's going to want from Abram. And Abram sure doesn't seem to know, but it's more is disclosed, right? And the counting of the stars is this beautiful image. And now this idea that Abram's job in the covenant is just kind of sit still and let this darkness come over you and I'll take it from here.
Well, Abram doesn't at the start. God says, hey, don't be afraid. And do not be afraid means, hey, I've got good news for you. I'm your shield, your reward. And Abram's response is to have no part of it. Abram's response is a lament, an angry complaint prayer. What are you going to give me? I continue childless. The heir of my house is Eliezer. You have given me no offspring. That Abram responds with an angry prayer for help, a lament. And then God's response to that in turn, that is, if you took out, just cut and paste the parts Abram's speech, and it's a lament psalm that's broken into like 3 parts. And then God's response to Abraham's accusation is to enter the covenant again fully and increase the promise with, as Matt said, this beautiful image of descendants as many as the stars in the sky. I was given a book for Christmas. I did not know this was to be part of the podcast for those who are looking online. Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God. Even though the wrestling with God happens later in Genesis, this is a great example of what it means to wrestle with God, to treat God's promises as so real that you can argue with God when they aren't actualized.
But is Eliezer of Damascus just kind of a schmuck? Is that part of what's assumed here? Or just like,
yeah, of course.
Do you really want to build a nation out of Eliezer?
I know. It doesn't feel good, does it? If you're Eliezer, you're like, hey, what about me?
Yeah.
No, that is always the problem, right? When the parent or the person says, I'm not happy with who my heir is. The heir is standing right there. So you're Bethlehem, you go, hey, why Jerusalem all the time? Bethlehem, can I get a little help?
You go to Psalm 27?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a beautiful psalm. It really is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it's my favorite psalm, especially verses, frankly, 1 through 4. Verse 1 means so much. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? But also, just that much about fearing so many things in life and then clinging to God, who is light and who is salvation, who is stronghold.
Well, I also imagine, since this is Jesus scripture, I pair this with the gospel text and imagine Jesus praying this, right? Or Jesus calling this to mind when he realizes his inevitability in Jerusalem, that, in part, do you think, what did Jesus hold on to? And it was a psalm like this, right? Psalm 27, of knowing God and knowing who would protect him and come to his aid, and what shall he fear? So I hear it on the lips of Jesus, and then also, as you said, Rolf, in our own places of fear and feeling like enemy has surrounded us, the evildoers have surrounded us, and yet we live in the house of the Lord, and so it's so reassuring, right? A balm.
So, like, psalms about enemies usually don't do much for me. I mean, this one doesn't. I don't think this uses the term enemy, but I like the way this one. You need to wait it out a little bit. You know what I mean? Like in verses 2 and 3, it sounds like well, I don't know what this feels like. But when you get down to, and the commentary by Carol Bechtel talks a bit about this as well, but you get to verse 12 and this idea of false witnesses, and that all of a sudden starts to make more sense, right? As opposed to people who want to consume my flesh. But I mean, to talk about living within a culture of lies or in a context of lies, or where somebody feels like his neighbors are no longer trustworthy, or is being slandered in some way. I mean, it helps capture a sense of powerlessness for the speaker of the psalm to either tell their own story or to be their own person or to find justice or whatever the bigger topics might be, but then to find that as an opportunity for praise, not just to say, I'm going to be patient and trust God, but to recognize that God is the one who really sees, that God is the one who holds truth or who is aware of the truth. Does that make sense in terms of how it makes the power of God less abstract, but more, for me at least, something tangible that helps you think about a certain circumstance and how I'm going to summon the spiritual or psychological strength to persevere in that kind of a circumstance.
Makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of the Psalms of trust are very real about the presence of threat, whether Psalm 23, the walking through the valley of the shadow of death, or Psalm 46, the mountains shake in the midst of the sea. And here with talk about enemies and false witness. What makes the Psalms of trust so powerful is that they don't pretend that the threats around us are abstract. They're very real. And that's why this psalm came to light so much for me when I was young. When we had a big Lilly grant here 15 years ago, and part of it was about the Bible and the Bible coming to life in people's really coming to life in people's lives. And one of the things we learned is that the Bible really starts to mean stuff to people when they go through crises. And those can't be manufactured, but you don't have to, because life's going to bring them out eventually for everybody. So, yeah, I really think that the Bible, the Psalm is powerful in that way, in how it names reality. And that's what Jesus is doing in the gospel story. I do want to lift up verse 4 because it doesn't fit at all the gospel lesson for today, and that's okay. But the author says, one thing I asked of the Lord, and this I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, which is, the house of the Lord is a temple, and to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. That's Jesus is not saying that, but it is something really worth thinking about. What does it mean to seek and to behold the beauty of the Lord in our lives? I think, at least in the forms of Protestantism from which three of us come, we don't talk much about the beauty of the Lord and what it means to behold God's beauty. It's a totally different piece of the puzzle, the spiritual puzzle, that is worth thinking about.
Yeah, I like that.
Do you guys have any meditative qualities to your prayer and spiritual life where the beauty of the Lord? Because even though I try to think about this often, I actually don't. It's not a regular. Thanksgiving and praise are, but for me, those are not necessarily about the beauty of the Lord.
I'll add that to my spiritual list.
The aesthetics of worship matter a lot for me sometimes, depending upon the season or the situation. Yeah, visual arts, music.
Mm-hmm.
Matter a lot.
Dance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me?
Dance.
Music.
I saw a lovely liturgical dance last Sunday at my congregation. It was the best one I've ever
But
seen.
do you do it?
No, I consume it.
You consume it. I like.
People don't want him to do it. Let's be clear about that.
I am a patron and a consumer of the arts, not so much a practitioner, but that's for the good of everybody.
It's for the good of all people.
That's right.
That he's refrained from that. Should we go on to Philippians?
We should.
because I'm avoiding whether or not I do liturgical dance. Okay, we have this lovely reading from Philippians and the way in which Paul is inviting the Philippians into this joint imitation or co-imitation of how does it, what does it mean to live in the cross of Christ? And so I think that that's one element of this passage that a preacher could take is to contemplate or think about the kind of living, the kind of way of being that Paul has talked about in Philippians, that you get a little bit of a glimpse in that in verse 4:1, where he's talked about joy and love and how you can kind of pull in other aspects of Philippians to say, well, what does it mean to be a co-imitator with Paul in living a life that is marked by the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, it's not clear in Philippians who the threats are. There's a couple of references to other people that the readers are supposed to be aware of, and some of them are here. This idea of, the flip side of what you're talking about, Karoline, I think, is what does it mean to live as an enemy of the cross of Christ, and who are these people that are referred to and in verse 19. And these are not, I think, outsiders to the church. He's not talking about wider Greco-Roman culture. I think he's talking about folks within the boundaries of the church, but are nevertheless ashamed of the cross of Christ, or in some ways have left it behind or abandoned it. And so he talks about, their God is the belly. Their minds are set on earthly things. This could be a way in which they're imagining their own sense of power, their own giftedness. Paul has attacked people like that in other letters, who are kind of too enamored with the promises of power that come their way. And so he reorients that then in verse 20, right? That our citizenship is in heaven. And that's not him saying, this world is not my home, or hang on, we'll get to heaven soon. This is Paul saying that we have a different allegiance, right? Mm-hmm. An allegiance not to the things of this world, the power of this world, the dominance of this world, but our political reality, our sense of what the good life is, or what a good community is just utterly otherworldly in comparison to this. Different values.
The line, their God is the belly, has always been for me both. It's a funny line, but it's also, I feel, skewered. I've always interpreted it, and this may be wrong, but that is that when our desires guide us, when our fleshly desires guide us, that it's a metaphor of hunger and of people giving into hunger, maybe even to the point of gluttony, that their hunger drives them. To me, it's always been very that sense, oh yeah, that's me. When I'm hungry, I'll make all sorts of bad choices for myself about what I'm going to eat. And also watching my kids over the last 20 years, like they're willing to cut each other out. Like if they want that extra, they're like, get away from, they're willing to get in there and serve themselves, literally. It feels to me like a very apt description of the human condition.
Sermon Brainwave is a production of Luther Seminary's Working Preacher. Working Preacher has been a trusted source of inspiration, interpretation, and imagination for preachers worldwide since 2007. Find episodes and links at workingpreacher.org/brainwave, and be sure to like, rate, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.